In the world of US politics, double haters are potential voters who really just don't like the candidate from either major political party, and they thus decide whether and how to vote based on who they dislike the least, or in some cases, who they would like to hurt the most. This isn't a uniquely American concept, as voters in many global democracies face similar situations, but it seems to be an especially pressing issue in this year's upcoming US presidential election. And Election Day is a week away as of the day this episode goes live, because the race is just so very close according to most trusted polls. In that same context, swing states are states that could swing either way, theoretically at least, in terms of who their votes go to. And because these swing states contain enough electoral college votes to allow even the candidate who doesn't win the popular vote to win the presidency, that makes them especially vital battlegrounds. So there's a scramble going on right now for both parties, the Democrats and Republicans, to muster their existing bases, to shore up some of the demographic groups they are relying upon in this election, and to get their messaging in front of as many of those double haters and other undecideds as possible, so as to maybe, possibly, swing this neck-and-neck race in their direction. Toward that end, we have seen some simply staggering sums of money pulled in and spent by both major parties' campaigns. It's looking likely that this will be the most expensive election season in US history, with just under $16 billion in spending across federal races alone, which is up from just over $15 billion in 2020, according to nonpartisan group Open Secrets. That actually means this election will probably end up being just a smidgen cheaper than 2020's election if you adjust for inflation, rather than comparing in absolute dollar terms. But both of these races will have been several times as expensive as previous elections, weighing in at about double 2016's cost and triple what these races tended to cost previously in the early 2000s. For perspective, too, US elections were already quite a lot more expensive than elections held in other wealthy countries. According to a rundown by the Wall Street Journal, Canada's 2021 election only cost something like $69 million in inflation-adjusted terms, and US elections tend to cost about 40 times more per person, so this is a population-scaled figure, than elections in the UK and Germany. The cost of local elections in the US have been increasing as well, in some cases substantially, and that's part of why unpaid exposure and promotion is becoming increasingly valuable. It takes a lot of communications oomph to puncture the hubbub of commercial marketing messages in the United States. And while pulling in a lot of money to buy ads and fund other promotional efforts is one way to do that, it is also possible to approach the problem asymmetrically, going to people where they already are, basically, and getting some of that valuable face time without having to spend a cent on it. And that's what I'd like to talk about today, specifically efforts by candidates to get on popular podcasts, and why this medium in particular seems to be the go-to for campaigns at a moment in which the electoral stakes are historically high. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. Podcasts, by their traditional definition at least, are audio files delivered using an old-school open technology called RSS. In the years since they first emerged, beginning in the early days of the 2000s, the transmission mechanisms for these audio files have become a bit more sophisticated, despite being based on essentially the same technology. They've been joined, though, by utilities that allow folks to stream undownloaded audio content, to ping the servers where these audio files are stored more regularly, and to attach all kinds of interesting and useful metadata to these files, which add more context to them, while also providing the fundamentals of basic micropayment schemes and the capacity to include video versions of an episode alongside audio. That video component has been pushed forward in part by the success of content makers on YouTube, where for a long while, podcasters have promoted their audio shows with visualized snippets, behind-the-scenes videos, and other such add-on content. Over the past handful of years, though, it has also become a hotbed of original video podcast content, some podcasters even using YouTube as their native distribution client. And that, combined with Spotify's decision to start offering video podcasting content alongside audio podcasting content, in part to compete with YouTube, has pushed video podders to the forefront of many charts. Multi-person conversational and interview shows have maybe benefited the most from that shift toward video, as being able to see the people recording these shows and to watch their body language, all the little micro expressions and other components of conversation and social dynamics that are often left out of pure audio shows, has helped them attract more listeners and viewers, while also making these shows an even more potent source of parasocial camaraderie, which was especially valuable during the lockdown-heavy phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, but which is also arguably a valuable thing to provide at a period in which a lot of people across all demographics are suffering from intense loneliness and a perceived lack of connection. The sense of familiarity that folks felt listening to a familiar voice in their ear on a regular basis has been emphasized still further by the ability to see those people on their phones and TVs and laptops in the same way and at that same regular cadence. The business model of podcasting has also contributed to the expansion of this type of show, as while podcasting has never been as big and spendy an industry as comparable broadcast mediums, it has been growing, with most shows leaning on some combination of ads, sponsorships, memberships, patronage models, and subscriptions to keep their operations in the black. Some shows make use of many or all of these income generation approaches, and many of them have varied their business models based on the boom and bust phases the industry has seen over the years. So when ad revenue plummets, formerly ad-heavy shows will pivot to memberships. And when the listener membership well grows shallow or dry, they might shift to some kind of featured sponsor model. As of early 2024, there are more than 500 million regular podcast listeners globally, and ad spending in this space globally reached over $4 billion for the first time this year. That aforementioned shift toward video has tilted a lot of listening in that direction, with about a third of all podcast listeners in the United States also watching at least one podcast, rather than just listening to it. That watchability component has also nudged YouTube and Spotify into the lead in terms of podcast delivery, alongside Apple, which did not invent the podcast, even though the medium is named after their iPod product, but they did bring it to the forefront and make it widely available. Apple's relative lack of investment in this space for years left the doors open for those other competitors, and again, their decision to feature video podcast content alongside pure audio shows has shifted the landscape of this industry substantially, raising questions about what a podcast even is, if any old YouTube show could also theoretically be categorized as such. It is a blurry distinction at this point, a bit like the debate over whether audiobooks should be considered books, or if only written visual versions of that format should bear that label. Also worth noting here is that nearly half, about 47% of all US citizens ages 12 and up listen to a podcast at least once a month, and 34% listen every week. 11% of that demographic's daily audio time is spent listening to podcasts, which is quadruple the figure a decade ago, in 2014. And 23% of weekly podcast listeners in the US spend 10 or more hours with these shows each week, though the average listening time each week is also pretty high, weighing in at 7.4 hours. Podcasts have diverse audiences and hit a range of economic classes and people of varying education levels, though it leans slightly higher than the average in terms of both educational attainment and income, and increasingly, folks seem to be especially influenced by podcast recommendations. 46% of weekly podcast listeners reporting that they purchased something based on a recommendation or advertisement they heard on a podcast. All of which points at why podcasts, and especially interview podcasts, and even more especially video-heavy interview podcasts, have become such highly desired media real estate in this year's US presidential election. These sorts of shows are not always the most desired medium for brands because tracking return on investment, money earned per dollar spent basically, is difficult with podcasts compared to, for instance, buying ads on streaming TV shows or social media, because there's a lot more trackers on those types of content. But podcasts are great for raising awareness and general brand building efforts, which is exactly what these candidates and their parties are aiming for. So more people are listening to these things, more people tend to trust what they hear on podcasts more than other types of media, and the demographics these shows reach are highly desirable politically. This is why, over the past few weeks, candidates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have appeared on some of the biggest podcasts in existence right now. Call Her Daddy for the former, and the Joe Rogan Experience for the latter. Both of these appearances were ostensibly pretty risky, as podcast interviewers tend to color outside the lines a lot more compared to hosts on conventional television or radio shows, but the potential upsides were huge for both, as Alex Cooper, the host of Call Her Daddy, which is kind of a comedic advice show, has become a massive force in the world of women's issues, and she recently became one of the best paid and most influential podcasters in the world by leaving Spotify for SiriusXM, that change beginning in 2025. For a reported $100 million. Joe Rogan, in contrast, has consistently been the #1 podcast in the world for years, and his audience skews toward the people Trump wants to reach. The listening base is 80% male. More than half of those listeners are ages 18 to 34, more than a third identify as independents politically, and a little over a quarter are Democrats, who might be convinced to switch sides for this election because of Rogan's somewhat conservative-leaning, independent stance on most things. Trump recorded a 3-hour podcast interview with Rogan, leaning into the host's chilled out but often heavy and asymmetric question-laden format, and that was blasted out to the show's 14.5 million Spotify followers and 17.5 million YouTube subscribers. Call Her Daddy is the second biggest podcast on most networks after Rogan's show, and while it has a comparably meager 5 million weekly listeners, the show's demographics lean heavily toward women, and especially young women, which is seemingly favorable to the messaging Harris wants to megaphone at this point in her campaign. She's rounded out that appearance with appearances on other shows like All the Smoke, which is hosted by a pair of NBA stars, and The Breakfast Club, which is hosted by the popular personality Charlemagne the God. Trump has appeared on quite a few podcasts of late as well, though they have largely been in the same demographic vein as Joe Rogan. Trump went on YouTuber Logan Paul's show Impulsive, for instance, alongside This Past Weekend with Theo Vaughn and the Lex Fridman podcast, all shows that lean heavily toward the young male demographic and which skew somewhat conservative and or toward the libertarian side of independent. Like many aspects of this election, we don't really know if these bets will pay off for these candidates and their campaigns. There's a lot to suggest that folks trust podcasts and podcasters, and that this industry may therefore be an excellent means of blasting a message to the right people, allowing politicians to realize a huge return on the time they invest preparing for their appearances and recording these interviews. On the other hand, there is a chance that, like many supposed means of reinforcing brand awareness and identity, that the numbers are kind of fuzzy and don't necessarily reflect the reality many people think they will reflect. It could be that folks will tune in and listen and then not do anything with what they learn. A more passive means of engagement that results in few, if any, real-world consequences, like voting. It could also be that one or the other or both of these parties aimed at the wrong shows and audiences, or at the wrong influencers to help them reach those audiences, which could result in the same not great outcome, but with their demographic assumptions to blame rather than the nature of the podcasting medium. We won't know for sure until after the election, and even then it'll still be an open question, because it's difficult to definitively link action and outcome when it comes to this facet of the political world. That said, it does seem pretty likely that for the next few elections at least, podcasters will carry somewhat higher credibility and weight, and consequently attract even more attention and probably ad dollars too, because it's becoming more and more difficult to reach the right people, the right potential voters, and podcasts are still new and Wild Westy enough that they could break through the hubbub, even when other content types struggle to do so. The book I'd like to recommend today is called You Sexy Thing by Kat Rambo. This book, in addition to being written by an author who has perhaps the coolest name of all science fiction authors, is what I consider to be kind of a cozy space opera. It's got interesting, fun, well-developed characters, and the plot and storyline and world in which it takes place is very interesting and compelling. But to me, one of the best aspects of this book and the sequel, which I also read and found to be quite good, is the dynamics between the different characters, the different species, the different places that they exist. The cultural dynamics in this book and its sequel are really fantastic. And that's an aspect of science fiction, speculative fiction worlds that are not always as well fleshed out as it is in this and similar sorts of books in this vein. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of You Sexy Thing by Kat Rambo. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.